Okay, Rachel, now let's take a look at theorem 10.12, and it's called the angles inside the circle theorem. Angles inside the circle theorem. And what do they mean by that? Here you have a circle, and you have two chords, any old two chords, okay? And they intersect. Well, they're going to form some angles. But only two of those angles are unique, right? Because if you know this one, then you know that. That's vertically opposite to that. And if you know this one, label 2, then you know that, which is also vertically opposite. So really, there are only two angles that we're after, even though there are a total of 4 angles that are formed when those two chords intersect. But we're after only 2 angles. Because if you know those 2, then you know the remaining 2. Okay? So that's what this theorem is going to tell us how to do. Okay? Let's read it. And try to relate it to this diagram. Okay? So I'm going to read it and try to relate it to that diagram. So it says, if 2 chords intersect inside a circle, so we have AC as a chord, BD as another chord intersecting inside, because there's a case for angles outside of a circle. That's the theorem 10.13, but this one is for inside. So these 2 chords must intersect inside this circle. Then the measure of each angle, you see, each angle, meaning each of these 2 angles, because we know, once we know these 2, we can know the other 2. So it's referring, so when it says the measure of each angle, it's referring to each of these 2 angles. They're not the same. Those 2 measures are not the same. It's going to give you formula for finding each one separately, right? Okay, and it says, so the measure of each angle is 1/2 the sum of the measures of 2 arcs. So for each angle, you need to think about 2 arcs, and you're going to find the measure of each of those 2 arcs and then add them together and take half of it. So it's like taking the average of the measure of the 2 arcs that are related to each angle. Okay, and what are those 2 arcs? Okay, so we say for each angle that we're talking about, you need to think about 2 arcs. Okay, so what are those 2 arcs? Those 2 arcs are defined as follows. Okay, measure of 2 arcs. 1, the arc intercepted by the angle we're trying to find. So what's the angle we're trying to find? So let's say it's angle 1. Okay, so what's the arc intercepted by angle 1? Well, you know that. Okay, you know it's DC. Okay, so that's one of the 2 arcs. Then the second arc, the arc intercepted by the vertical angle of the angle we're trying to find. So there's the vertical angle, which is this one. Even though that angle is equal to this that we're trying to find, but the arc intercepted by it is different. Okay, the arc intercepted by it is different. Okay, so the measure of that arc. Now remember, the measure of this arc is not this angle. The measure of this arc comes back to the center of the circle. The measure of this arc is not this angle 1. The measure of this arc is not this angle 1. The measure of this arc goes back also to the center of the circle. So the measure is the central angle, okay, for each of these arcs. So remember that. That's why, so sometimes these things are confusing. That's probably why you have a little difficulty with these sections, you know, because you have to remember at each point what you're talking about. There's so many angles floating around. So even though we're trying to find this angle, there are 2 arcs involved. and we have to find the measure of each of those two arcs. But the measure of those two arcs goes back to the center of the circle. Okay. So once you know, so for each of the angles, what are your two arcs? Then what are the measures of those two, each one of those two arcs? And then you sum them together and find half of it. So for measure of angle 1 is half into measure of arc DC plus measure of arc AB. And then measure of angle 2 is half of measure of AD plus measure of BC. Why? Because measure of BC is the angle intercepted by the angle we're trying to, is the arc. BC is the arc intercepted by the angle 2 that we're trying to find in that case. And the vertically opposite to it is this, and it intercepts arc AD. So those are the two arcs relevant in the case of angle 2. The two arcs are BC and AD, and now you find their measures. Okay, meaning AD, to find the measure of AD, it goes back to the center of the circle. Okay, from A and from D. Okay, so and once you, so the steps involved: identify which angle you're talking about, identify the two arcs that are relevant for that particular angle, meaning the first arc is the one that that angle itself intercepts, and then the second arc is the one that is intercepted by the angle that's vertically opposite to the angle we're trying to find. Okay, so once you find those two arcs, then find the measures of each of those two arcs, and then you sum them up and you divide by 2, or you find the average. This is the same as finding an average, right? You take two things, you add them, and you divide by 2. That's the finding the average of two things. Okay, so that's what that is. Now, theorem 10.13, like I said earlier, is for angles that are external. And we okay, let me quickly go through that next.